Thomas Mitchell had been standing guard at Buckingham Palace for 3 years, but nothing had prepared him for what would happen on that foggy Tuesday morning in November. The 24-year-old soldier from Yorkshire wore his red tunic with pride, his tall black bearskin hat making him appear even more imposing than his natural 6-foot frame suggested. His rifle stood perfectly positioned at his side, and his face remained as still as stone, just as he had been trained. The palace grounds buzzed with the usual activity. Tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras clicking constantly, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty or at least get a perfect shot of the famous guards. Tour guides spoke in multiple languages, explaining the history and traditions to eager visitors from around the world. Thomas had learned to tune out most of the noise, but today felt different somehow. Earlier that morning, his commanding officer had given him specific instructions about a special visit. A group of military officials from several countries would be touring the palace, and everything needed to be absolutely perfect. Thomas took pride in his duty, knowing that he represented not just himself but his regiment, his country, and centuries of British military tradition. As he stood at his post near the main entrance, Thomas noticed an elderly man approaching, slowly. The man walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane. He was well dressed in a dark navy coat and wore a small pin on his lapel that Thomas couldn't quite make out from his position. Unlike the typical tourists who hurried past with their phones and cameras, this man moved with deliberate purpose. The elderly visitor stopped directly in front of Thomas, studying him with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold decades of experience. Most people took photos and moved on quickly, but this man remained perfectly still, almost as if he was evaluating something important. Thomas maintained his stoic expression, staring straight ahead as his training demanded, but he could feel the intensity of the stranger's gaze. Minutes passed in silence. The morning mist began to clear, revealing more details of the palace courtyard. Other tourists continued their tours, but the elderly man remained motionless, creating an invisible bubble of quiet concentration around himself and the guard. Thomas began to wonder if something was wrong, but his training kept him rooted in position. Then, without any warning or explanation, the elderly man began to move his right hand in a very specific pattern. It wasn't random gestures or an attempt to get attention. Instead, his movements were precise, deliberate, and clearly intentional. His fingers moved in what appeared to be a complex series of signals, each motion carefully executed and held for exactly the right amount of time. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat as recognition dawned on him. These weren't random hand movements or some tourist's attempt at communication. What he was witnessing was something he had learned about in his military training, but never expected to see in real life. The elderly man was using military hand signals, but not just any signals. These were specific communications used by special forces units, codes that very few people would ever know or understand. The realization hit Thomas like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just any visitor to Buckingham Palace. The man standing before him had military experience and not just ordinary service. The precision of his signals, the confidence in his movements, and the knowledge he was displaying suggested something far more significant than a casual encounter between a tourist and a palace guard. As the silent communication continued, Thomas found himself facing an unprecedented situation. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but never for something quite like this. The protocol was clear about maintaining his position and remaining motionless, but the signals being transmitted to him seemed to be requesting something entirely different. The elderly man's gestures were becoming more insistent, though still executed with military precision. The morning air felt charged with tension as Thomas realized he was being tested, or perhaps trusted with something important. The weight of his responsibility as a royal guard suddenly felt heavier than ever before. Whatever was happening in front of him was clearly significant, and his response could have consequences he couldn't even imagine. Other palace visitors continued walking past, completely unaware of the silent drama unfolding between the guard and the mysterious elderly man. The tourists chatted excitedly about the palace's history, took selfies with the guards in the background, and moved on to the next attraction on their itinerary. But for Thomas, time seemed to have stopped completely. The elderly man's final gesture was unmistakable. It was a signal Thomas recognized from his advanced training, one that carried serious implications about identity and military rank. As the meaning became clear, Thomas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the November weather. He was standing face to face with someone whose presence at Buckingham Palace was far from coincidental, and whose military background was evidently much more distinguished than his appearance might suggest to casual observers. The signal the elderly man had just completed was one that Thomas had learned during his specialized training with the Special Air Service Liaison Program. It was a recognition code used only by high-ranking military personnel, specifically those who had served in covert operations. The gesture identified the man as someone with security clearance levels that exceeded most normal military ranks. Thomas's mind raced as he tried to process what this meant and how he should respond. According to his training, when such a signal was given, a guard was supposed to acknowledge it with a subtle response that wouldn't be noticed by civilians, but would confirm to the signaler that the message had been understood. However, Thomas also knew that breaking his stoic guard position, even slightly, could result in serious disciplinary action. Royal guards were famous worldwide for never moving, never speaking, and never reacting to anything happening around them. The elderly man waited patiently, his sharp eyes never leaving Thomas's face. There was no impatience or frustration in his expression, just the calm confidence of someone who understood military protocol and expected it to be followed correctly. His posture remained dignified despite his apparent age and the walking cane he carried. Everything about his bearing suggested a lifetime of military service and command. Thomas found himself caught between two equally important sets of training. His Royal Guard duties demanded absolute stillness and silence, while his Special Forces training required him to respond appropriately to legitimate military communications. The conflict created a moment of intense internal struggle as he weighed his options and their potential consequences. The palace courtyard continued its normal rhythm around them. A group of Japanese tourists posed for photos nearby, their guide explaining the significance of the changing of the guard ceremony. Children on a field trip pressed against the palace gates hoping to spot someone famous. None of them had any idea that a critical military communication was taking place just meters away from their excited chatter and camera flashes. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, Thomas made his decision. He had sworn an oath to serve his country and follow military protocol, and that oath extended beyond his current posting as a palace guard. Very slowly and almost imperceptibly, he moved his left hand in a brief acknowledgement signal, keeping his arm positioned so that the movement would be invisible to tourists, but clear to the elderly man watching him. The response was immediate and remarkable. The elderly gentleman's stern expression softened into what might have been approval, though his face remained largely composed. He gave an almost invisible nod of acknowledgement, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small envelope. Without any flourish or dramatic gesture, he placed it carefully on the ground near Thomas's feet, positioning it so it wouldn't blow away in the morning breeze. Thomas watched from the corner of his eye as the man straightened up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. For just a moment their eyes met directly, and Thomas saw something in the stranger's gaze that spoke of shared understanding and mutual respect between soldiers. It was a look that transcended rank and age, acknowledging the bond that exists between those who have sworn to serve their country. Without another gesture or backward glance, the elderly man turned and began walking away. His pace was unhurried, but purposeful, and he moved with the same dignity that had marked his entire interaction with Thomas. He disappeared into the crowd of tourists and palace visitors, becoming just another face among the hundreds of people who visited Buckingham Palace every day. Thomas remained perfectly still, but his mind was racing with questions and concerns. The envelope lay on the ground near his feet, clearly meant for him, but he couldn't retrieve it without obviously breaking his guard position. Palace security cameras monitored every inch of the grounds, and any unusual movement would be noticed and reported. He needed to wait for the right moment to act without compromising his duties or drawing unwanted attention. The morning progressed normally, despite the extraordinary encounter. Tour groups came and went, visitors took their photos, and the palace, staff continued their daily routines. Thomas maintained his position flawlessly, giving no outward sign of the internal turmoil he was experiencing. Years of military training had taught him to compartmentalize his thoughts and focus on the task at hand, skills that served him well in this unprecedented situation. As the hours passed, Thomas began to worry that the envelope might be blown away by the wind or noticed by palace security before he could retrieve it. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders as he realized that whatever message the elderly man had left might be time-sensitive or critically important. The precision of the military signals suggested this was no casual communication or simple message. Finally, after what seemed like the longest morning of his life, Thomas's relief arrived for the routine rotation of guards. As the changing of the guard ceremony began, he saw his opportunity. In the carefully choreographed movements that tourists found so fascinating, Thomas managed to position himself near the envelope during a standard maneuver. With practiced precision that years of military training had perfected, he palmed the small envelope without anyone noticing the action. The envelope felt heavier than its size would suggest, and Thomas could tell there was more inside than just a simple note. As he marched away from his post in perfect formation with his fellow guards, he wondered what secrets the mysterious elderly man had entrusted to him, and whether his decision to respond to those military signals would change everything about his quiet life as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Thomas waited until he was completely alone in his quarters before examining the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he turned it over, noting the absence of any markings, addresses, or identifying features on the outside. The paper felt expensive and official, the kind used for important government correspondence. Taking a deep breath, he carefully opened the sealed flap, trying not to damage anything that might be evidence of its origin. Inside, he found two items that made his heart race with excitement and concern. The first was a small laminated identification card bearing the photograph of the elderly man who had approached him. The name on the card read, Colonel James Harrison, retired, followed by a series of numbers and security clearances that Thomas recognized as being among the highest levels of military classification. The card also bore the insignia of multiple special operations units, including some that Thomas had only heard whispered about in his advanced training. The second item was a handwritten letter on official Ministry of Defense letterhead. The handwriting was neat and precise, the kind developed through decades of military reports and official communications. As Thomas began to read, he realized that his encounter that morning had been far more significant than he could have possibly imagined. The letter explained that Colonel Harrison was conducting an unofficial security assessment of Buckingham Palace's guard protocols. He had been asked by military intelligence to test whether the guards would recognize and respond appropriately to legitimate military communications. The colonel's appearance as an ordinary tourist was intentional, designed to see if guards could identify genuine military personnel, even when they weren't in uniform or officially announced. Thomas learned that his response to the military signals had been exactly correct according to protocol, demonstrating both his specialized training and his ability to make appropriate decisions under pressure. However, the letter went on to explain that not all guards would have recognized the signals or known how to respond properly. Colonel Harrison had specifically requested to test Thomas because his personnel file indicated advanced training that made him uniquely qualified for such an assessment. The letter continued with information that made Thomas's role in palace security suddenly seem much more important than he had ever realized. Colonel Harrison wrote that there were ongoing concerns about potential security threats to the royal family, and that guards with specialized training like Thomas's might be called upon to play more active roles in protective operations. The routine of standing motionless and looking ceremonial was only one aspect of what royal guards might need to do in extraordinary circumstances. Most surprisingly, the letter included an invitation for Thomas to participate in a special security briefing that would take place the following week. The briefing would be conducted by military intelligence officers and would cover enhanced protocols for palace guards who had demonstrated exceptional awareness and capabilities. Thomas realized that his split-second decision to respond to Colonel Harrison's signals had identified him as someone trusted with higher levels of responsibility. As Thomas read and reread the letter, he began to understand that his encounter with Colonel Harrison had been a turning point in his military career. What had seemed like a random interaction with a tourist was actually a carefully planned evaluation that he had somehow passed with flying colors. The weight of this realization was both thrilling and intimidating, as he considered what additional responsibilities might come with this recognition. The letter concluded with specific instructions about maintaining absolute secrecy regarding the encounter and the contents of the message. Colonel Harrison emphasized that the security assessment was classified information that could not be shared with fellow guards, family members, or anyone else without proper authorization. Thomas was instructed to memorize the important details, and then destroy both the letter and the identification card using specific methods that would leave no trace. Thomas spent the next hour studying every detail of the documents, committing the important information to memory as instructed. He noted the dates, times, and reference numbers that he would need for the upcoming briefing. The colonel's background was impressive, with service records spanning multiple decades and operations in locations around the world that Thomas recognized as having been significant military engagements. As he prepared to destroy the documents according to the instructions, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed in just one day. That morning, he had been a relatively ordinary palace guard, proud of his service but expecting his duties to remain ceremonial and routine. Now he found himself recruited into something that sounded much more like active military intelligence work. The irony wasn't lost on him that tourists visited Buckingham Palace every day, hoping to witness something exciting or dramatic. Never, knowing that real military operations and security assessments were happening right in front of them. The elderly man with the walking cane, who had seemed like just another visitor, was actually a highly decorated military officer conducting classified evaluations of palace security. Thomas carefully followed the destruction protocols outlined in Colonel Harrison's letter, ensuring that no trace remained of the documents or their contents. As he watched the last pieces of paper burn to ash, he wondered what challenges and opportunities awaited him in this new chapter of his military service. The quiet life of a ceremonial guard was apparently about to become much more complicated and potentially dangerous. That night, as he lay in his bunk trying to process everything that had happened, Thomas realized that he would never again be able to look at the tourists and visitors at Buckingham Palace in quite the same way. Any one of them could be more than they appeared, and his job as a royal guard now included responsibilities he was only beginning to understand. The secret gesture that had started everything was just the beginning of what promised to be an extraordinary journey. The week following Thomas's encounter with Colonel Harrison passed slowly, filled with routine guard duties that now seemed different somehow. Every tourist who approached his post was scrutinized more carefully, every unusual movement or gesture analyzed for potential significance. Thomas found himself wondering how many other seemingly ordinary interactions at the palace might actually be classified operations or security tests that he simply wasn't aware of. His fellow guards noticed no change in his behavior, which was exactly as it should be according to his training. Military personnel learned early in their careers how to compartmentalize information and maintain normal operations even when dealing with classified matters. Thomas continued his duties with the same professionalism and attention to detail that had earned him his position at Buckingham Palace. On Thursday morning, Thomas received new orders that appeared routine but contained subtle indicators that told him these were related to Colonel Harrison's assessment. He was assigned to special duty at a side entrance of the palace, a position that was typically reserved for guards who needed to interact more directly with official visitors. The assignment came with instructions to report to a specific office within the palace complex after his shift ended. The office Thomas was directed to was located in a section of Buckingham Palace that he had never seen before, despite his 3 years of service. The corridors were narrower and less ornate than the public areas, designed clearly for official business rather than impressing visitors. Military personnel and government officials moved through these hallways with the purposeful efficiency of people engaged in important work. When Thomas knocked on the designated door, he was greeted by a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself simply as Agent Morrison. Her manner was professional but friendly, and she immediately put Thomas at ease with her straightforward approach to the conversation. She led him into a small conference room where Colonel Harrison was waiting, looking exactly as dignified as he had during their encounter outside the palace. Colonel Harrison stood and shook Thomas's hand with genuine warmth, thanking him for his discretion and professionalism in handling their previous meeting. He explained that Thomas's response to the military signals had been textbook perfect, demonstrating exactly the kind of awareness and quick thinking that made him valuable for enhanced security duties. The assessment had been designed to identify guards who could handle more complex responsibilities if the need arose. Agent Morrison opened a folder and began explaining that Buckingham Palace security operated on multiple levels that most people never realized existed. The ceremonial guards that tourists photographed were certainly important for tradition and public relations, but there were also covert security measures involving specially trained personnel who could respond to threats while maintaining their normal duties and appearances. Thomas learned that several other palace guards had been selected for similar assessments over the past months, though not all had recognized the significance of the military signals or responded appropriately. Those who had demonstrated the necessary skills and judgment were being invited to participate in an enhanced training program that would prepare them for potential emergency situations involving the royal family's security. The training program would be conducted during off-duty hours and would cover advanced surveillance techniques, threat assessment, emergency communication protocols, and coordinated response procedures. Participants would learn to identify suspicious behavior among palace visitors, recognize potential security threats, and respond effectively while maintaining their ceremonial duties and public image as traditional guards. Colonel Harrison emphasized that this enhanced training was not intended to replace the palace's existing security apparatus, but rather to create an additional layer of protection using personnel who were already in position and trained in military procedures. The Royal Guard's unique combination of military skills and constant presence at the palace made them ideal candidates for this type of dual-purpose assignment. Thomas was given several documents to review, including training schedules, security protocols, and confidentiality agreements. Everything was classified at levels that required special clearance, and he was reminded repeatedly of the serious legal and professional consequences of any security breaches. The responsibility was significant, but so was the trust being placed in him by military intelligence officers. As the briefing continued, Thomas began to understand the broader context of his selection for this program. Recent international events had raised concerns about potential threats to high-profile government officials and royal family members. Intelligence agencies were working to strengthen security measures without creating obvious changes that might alarm the public or signal defensive weaknesses to potential threats. The meeting concluded with Thomas being sworn to an enhanced secrecy oath and provided with emergency contact procedures that he could use if he ever encountered anything suspicious. During his palace duties, he was also given a small discreet communication device that looked like an ordinary earpiece, but could connect him instantly with security coordinators if necessary. Walking back through the palace corridors after the briefing, Thomas felt the weight of his new responsibilities settling on his shoulders. His role as a royal guard had evolved from ceremonial duties to actual security work that could have real consequences for the safety of some of the most important people in the country. The tourists who would photograph him tomorrow had no idea that he was now trained and equipped to respond to threats they couldn't even imagine. That evening, as Thomas reviewed the training materials he had been given, he reflected on how a single moment of recognition and proper response to military signals had changed the entire trajectory of his service. Colonel Harrison's test had been designed to identify guards with the skills and judgment needed for enhanced security duties, and Thomas had apparently demonstrated exactly what they were looking for. The secret gesture that had started everything was beginning to reveal its true significance. It wasn't just about following military protocol or demonstrating knowledge of special forces communications. It was about proving that he could be trusted with responsibilities that went far beyond standing motionless in a red uniform while tourists took pictures. Thomas was now part of a select group of guards who served as both ceremonial figures and covert security operatives. protecting the royal family in ways that the public would never know about or understand. Thomas's enhanced training began the following Monday in a nondescript building several miles from Buckingham Palace. The facility looked like an ordinary office complex from the outside, but inside it contained sophisticated training rooms, surveillance equipment, and communication centers that rivaled anything he had seen during his regular military service. 6 other palace guards had been selected for the program, each having passed similar assessments to the one Colonel Harrison had conducted. The training instructor was a former Special Air Service operative named Captain Williams, who had spent 15 years in covert operations before transitioning to security consulting for government facilities. She was compact and efficient in her movements, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from extensive field experience. Her approach to training was practical and direct, focusing on skills that could be applied immediately in real-world situations at the palace. During the first week, Thomas learned advanced observation techniques that would allow him to monitor crowd behavior and identify potential threats without appearing to do anything other than stand at attention. The training covered subtle eye movement patterns, peripheral, vision enhancement, and methods for mentally cataloging and remembering important details about suspicious individuals. He practiced these skills for hours, learning to maintain his ceremonial stillness while conducting sophisticated surveillance. The communication protocols were particularly fascinating to Thomas. He learned to use nearly invisible hand signals that could convey complex information to other trained guards or security personnel without alerting observers. These signals were far more advanced than the basic military communications he had learned earlier in his career, designed specifically for use in high-security environments where maintaining cover was essential. Captain Williams also taught the guards how to recognize various types of surveillance equipment, weapons concealment methods, and behavioral patterns that might indicate hostile intent. The training included detailed instruction on how to respond to different threat levels while maintaining their ceremonial duties and avoiding panic among palace visitors. Each scenario was practiced repeatedly until the responses became automatic. One of the most challenging aspects of the training was learning to coordinate with the palace's existing security teams without revealing their enhanced roles to unauthorized personnel. Thomas discovered that there were multiple layers of security operating at Buckingham Palace, each with different responsibilities and clearance levels. His new role would require him to interface with some of these teams while remaining completely unknown to others. The second week of training focused on specific threats that intelligence agencies considered most likely at royal residences. Thomas learned about various terrorist organizations, their typical methods of operation, and the warning signs that might indicate an imminent attack. The information was sobering, making him realize that the ceremonial aspects of his job were just one part of what could become a very dangerous responsibility. Captain Williams emphasized repeatedly that the enhanced guards were not intended to be the primary response to serious threats, but rather an early warning system and initial response capability, until specialized security teams could take control. Their unique position as seemingly decorative guards gave them access to areas and perspectives that traditional security personnel couldn't maintain without appearing obvious to potential threats. During the third week, Thomas participated in realistic training scenarios that simulated various emergency situations at Buckingham Palace. These exercises were conducted in facilities that had been designed to replicate the palace layout exactly, complete with crowds of people playing the roles of tourists and visitors. The realism was unsettling, particularly when the scenarios involved simulated attacks on members of the royal family. Thomas found that his years of military training served him well in these simulations, but the enhanced protocols required a level of subtlety and discretion that was entirely new to him. He had to learn to respond to threats while maintaining his ceremonial appearance and avoiding actions that might create panic or reveal the existence of covert security measures to unauthorized observers. The final week of training covered advanced emergency procedures and coordination with other security agencies. Thomas learned about backup communication systems, evacuation protocols, and procedures for securing areas of the palace during various types of emergencies. The complexity of these systems was impressive, involving coordination between palace guards, local police, military units, and intelligence agencies. Throughout the training, Thomas was impressed by the professionalism and expertise of his fellow guards who had been selected for the program. Each had demonstrated exceptional skills and judgment in their own assessment situations, and their diverse backgrounds and experiences created a strong team dynamic. They developed a mutual trust and respect that would be essential if they ever had to work together during an actual emergency. Captain Williams concluded the training program with a reminder that their enhanced roles were likely to remain inactive for most of their service, existing primarily as a precautionary measure against potential threats that might never materialize. However, she emphasized that their readiness and vigilance were essential components of the overall security strategy, even if their contributions remained invisible to the public and unacknowledged in official records. As Thomas prepared to return to his regular duties at Buckingham Palace, he reflected on how much he had learned and changed during the intensive training period. The skills he had acquired would make him a more effective guard even in routine situations, and the knowledge he had gained about palace security operations gave him a new appreciation for the complexity and importance of his role. The secret gesture that had identified him to Colonel Harrison had opened doors to training and responsibilities that he never could have imagined when he first put on the red tunic of a royal guard. Thomas realized that he was now part of a select group of individuals who served their country in ways that would never be publicly recognized or celebrated, but that were nonetheless essential for maintaining the security and stability that most people took for granted. 6 months after completing his enhanced training, Thomas found himself standing at his usual post outside Buckingham Palace on what appeared to be an ordinary spring morning. The tourists were already gathering despite the early hour, cameras ready to capture the iconic image of the motionless guards in their brilliant red uniforms. Thomas had learned to see these crowds differently now, his trained eyes automatically scanning for unusual behavior, suspicious packages, or individuals who seemed out of place among the typical visitors. The advanced surveillance techniques he had learned allowed him to monitor the entire area around his post while maintaining the traditional appearance of staring straight ahead with military precision. His peripheral vision had been trained to detect movement patterns that might indicate hostile intent, and his memory had been enhanced to catalog and retain important details about people and situations that warranted further attention. That morning, Thomas noticed a man in his 30s who had been observing the palace grounds for longer than typical tourists usually stayed in one location. The individual appeared to be conducting his own surveillance, taking careful note of guard positions, timing their movements, and paying particular attention to areas that weren't heavily monitored by obvious security cameras. His behavior triggered several of the warning indicators Thomas had learned during his training. Using the discreet communication device he had been given, Thomas sent a subtle alert to the Security Coordination Center, providing details about the suspicious individuals, location, appearance, and behavior. The response came back within minutes, instructing him to continue monitoring while additional security personnel moved into position to conduct a more thorough assessment of the potential threat. Thomas watched as plainclothes security officers began positioning themselves around the palace grounds, blending seamlessly with the tourist crowds while maintaining visual contact with the suspicious individual. The coordination was flawless, demonstrating the sophisticated security network that operated invisibly around the palace every day. Tourists continued taking pictures and enjoying their visits, completely unaware of the security operation unfolding around them. The suspicious individual seemed to recognize that he was being observed because his behavior began to change. Instead of continuing his detailed surveillance of the palace grounds, he started moving toward one of the main entrances with increased urgency. Thomas could see that he was carrying a backpack that hadn't been visible from his original position, and the way he moved suggested he might be preparing to take some kind of action. Through his earpiece, Thomas received instructions to maintain his position, but be prepared to respond if the situation escalated. Other enhanced guards at different posts around the palace had also been alerted, creating a network of trained observers who could coordinate their response if necessary. The months of training that had seemed abstract and hypothetical were suddenly very real and immediate. The plainclothes security officers moved closer to the suspicious individual, but before they could intercept him, he suddenly changed direction and began walking rapidly toward a group of school children who were on a field trip to see the palace. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he realized that the situation was developing into exactly the kind of scenario they had practiced during training. Without hesitation, Thomas used his communication device to alert the coordination center about the subject's movement toward the children, providing precise details about his location and apparent intentions. The response was immediate and decisive. Additional security personnel emerged from concealed positions around the palace grounds, moving with practiced efficiency to intercept the individual before he could reach the school group. The apprehension was handled so smoothly and professionally that most of the tourists in the area didn't even realize anything unusual had happened. The suspicious individual was quietly escorted away by security officers who appeared to be nothing more than palace staff dealing with a routine matter. The school children continued their tour, and the other visitors went on taking pictures and enjoying their morning at one of London's most famous landmarks. Later investigation revealed that the individual had been conducting surveillance as part of a planned protest that could have disrupted palace operations and potentially endangered visitors. His backpack contained materials for creating a disturbance rather than weapons, but the incident demonstrated the importance of the early detection and response capabilities that Thomas and his fellow enhanced guards provided. Colonel Harrison visited Thomas the following week to personally congratulate him on his professional handling of the situation. The colonel explained that the incident had validated the entire enhanced guard program, proving that specially trained ceremonial guards could serve as an effective early warning system for palace security. Thomas's alert had allowed security teams to respond before the situation could develop into something more serious. The recognition was gratifying, but Thomas understood that most of his service in this enhanced role would remain invisible and unacknowledged. The very effectiveness of the program depended on maintaining the public perception that the palace guards were purely ceremonial figures rather than trained security operatives. His contribution to royal security would be measured not by public recognition, but by the incidents that were prevented and the threats that never materialized. As Thomas returned to his regular duties, he reflected on the journey that had begun, with a simple hand gesture from an elderly man with a walking cane. That brief interaction had revealed capabilities and opened opportunities that transformed his military service from routine ceremonial duties to meaningful contributions to national security. The secret gesture that had silenced him initially had ultimately given him a voice in protecting some of the most important people in the country. Standing at his post the next morning, watching tourists gather for their daily pilgrimage to photograph the famous guards, Thomas understood that appearances could be deceiving in the most profound ways. The motionless figure in the red tunic that visitors saw was real, but it was only part of a much more complex reality that included training, vigilance, and responsibilities that extended far beyond what anyone could see or imagine. The secret, that had begun with military hand signals, had evolved into a career dedicated to secrets that would never be revealed, protecting a way of life that depended on security measures that remained forever hidden from public view.